Hello, everyone. I am re-recording the lectures from this past week because for whatever reason the audio didn't work. So this lecture is from Tuesday, October 13th. And what we did in this lecture is we covered the results from exam one, and then we went through the proteins chapter. And just so everybody knows, what I'm going to be doing for these is I'm going to be kind of truncating my lecture. So I'm just going to get to the point since I'm re-recording these and give you the basic information. I took out the questions of the day. I took out obviously discussions in the class I can't replicate here. So these recordings are going to be pretty much straight to the point. So with exam one, this shows a histogram of exam one. The average was 49 points out of 60. And you can see the distribution here. If you look from 60 down to 54 is roughly going to be an A, 53 to 48 B, etc., going the standard 90, 80, 70% curve. This score does reflect 3 points that that I gave everyone. So I basically took the scores you got back, added 3 points on, and that is shown here, and it's also shown on Moodle. And why I did this is because I looked at the exam, and there are 3 questions where the majority of people got them wrong. And so these are the 3 particular questions. Just to give you guys an idea of what the correct answers were, is the first one, hydrochloric acid does all of the following except it does not digest lipids. Okay, so it does A, B, and D, but not C. An example of a prebiotic is essentially a food source for the bacteria. And so what this would be D, a digestible carbohydrate, C, fiber in whole wheat bread. So the fiber is something that we can't digest, but the bacteria can. Okay, and then the third one, which of the following is true regarding glucagon? And what glucagon does is it increases blood glucose levels. So it does the opposite of insulin. And looking back in my notes, I spent a lot of time on insulin with very little on glucagon, so that's probably why you guys missed this question. Okay, if you want to do your exam, which is over, so it doesn't matter. And if your email is listed up here, okay, then you did not enter your X500 correct on the exam. So you can see some of the errors here. There's a space between some. People use the wrong letters, whatever it may be. So if you note yours here, please make sure you do the correct one next time. Okay, so that's exam one. So let's get going on the protein chapter. We'll make this quick. So we talked about carbohydrates and we talked about lipids, and so now we're going to spend some time talking on the other macronutrient, protein. And what separates protein out from those other two is nitrogen. Okay, so carbohydrates and proteins and lipids all have hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon, but only protein has nitrogen. And that is the unique thing about them. So the main components of protein are this nitrogen group, or what you call a amine group, which you can see on the bottom here. Let me see if you can see my arrow. Hopefully I have an arrow here. Hopefully you guys can see it on the screen. So you can see on the structure on the bottom, the NH2, that's what we call an amine group. Every amino acid has them, so there's many of these in proteins. There's a carboxyl group, or an acid group, which is basically carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. There's the hydrogen. And then what really determines the protein name is this side chain, or this R portion, okay? And if you look just at these amino acids, which of course are the building blocks of protein, and this is an example I show with the Legos. If you think about proteins, they're kind of like a Lego creation. So you have these 20 different amino acids that represent the individual Legos, and you can put them together in a multitude of ways, right? And when you put them together in a certain way, that creates a specific protein. And so that's what the way I think about amino acids as building blocks for proteins. And what these amino acids, what dictates which is really this carbon skeleton of whether they have, for example, glycine has a hydrogen, alanine has a methyl group, various other things that dictate the amino acids, and then when you put them all together, you get different proteins. So we can group amino acids into a couple primary classes, non-essential ones. So these are ones your body can make. So from usually carbohydrates or other metabolites in your body, you can convert them into these amino acids. Therefore, they are not required in the diet. Then we have essential amino acids, which we cannot make. So in other words, the only way we get them is from the diet, and therefore we have to eat them. We have to consume them in order to get enough. And then we have a third class, which we call conditionally essential amino acids. So these are ones that normally are non-essential, but due to some sort of event in life, whether it's for example, pregnancy, infancy, some sort of stress, trauma, then your requirement for these amino acids goes up to the point where you can't eat enough or you can't make enough, and then you have to start eating them. Okay? So it's basically surpassing the capacity of your body to make them, therefore you have to get them by diet. So these are the list of amino acids, the essential and non-essential. You do not, let me repeat, you do not need to memorize these. You probably will have to do that in other classes, but it's just a list really more for your reference. So when it comes to making the amino acids that we can make, which are the non-essential amino acids, the way our body does this is through a process called transamination. So amination is really referring to that amine group. Okay, and trans means you're transferring that amine group. So in this particular case, we have pyruvic acid, which is a normal metabolite of carbohydrate metabolism in our body. And what we're doing is we're transferring the nitrogen group from glutamic acid to pyruvic acid, and as a result, we get a new amino acid. So instead of glutamic acid, we get alanine. Okay, so we're just moving this nitrogen group from one to the other. Now, you don't need to know this specific formation of alanine, but it's just the concept of how we make them. We don't make nitrogen. We have to get the nitrogen from the diet, and so we transfer it from one amino acid to another. We also have a process of breaking down amino acids, and that's a process called deamination. Okay, so typically what our body does is when we're breaking down or we're using that nitrogen for the synthesis of other amino acids, the amino acids lose that nitrogen group, and what's left is basically this carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And so what typically is done if we want to get rid of that amine group is it's incorporated into urea in the liver, and then that urea leaves the liver, goes to the kidney where it goes out in our urine. So that's the main route of getting rid of nitrogen, whether it be excess nitrogen or just nitrogen we don't need anymore. So in addition to classifying as the essential and non-essential amino acids, we can also classify, that's how we classify amino acids. But for proteins, which is really, again, a whole mixture of these amino acids, we generally classify them as either complete or incomplete, okay? And what complete means is that if you look at the amino acid profile of a protein, so again, a protein is probably going to have a different mix of all these 20 amino acids. The complete proteins have a really good mix in regards to what we need versus what's in that protein. So in other words, if you have a protein that has lots of 19 of the amino acids but almost none of one of them, then that's not going to be a good protein because we still need that one to make proteins in our body. Okay? So it's a right mix. And generally, animal proteins are very good proteins. I'll talk about it in a second, but egg white or eggs are generally considered the best protein source as far as most complete. The incomplete proteins have inadequate amounts of specific amino acids or an amino acid. Okay? Typically, plant proteins don't have the best profile of amino acids. Some will become what we call limiting amino acids. So you don't have enough of that one to make proteins in your body. The exception of this is soy. So soy proteins, so soybeans, tofu, things like this, are generally considered pretty good proteins. Okay, so they're more on the complete protein spectrum. And one thing we can do if you have incomplete proteins is you can combine incomplete proteins from two different food sources, and together they will make more of a complete protein. So what's an example of this? So let's say you're eating legumes, so this would be basically beans mostly. They have very low amounts of methionine and tryptophan, okay? But if you eat them with something like a grain, a source of grain, for example, a bread or nuts or seeds, The protein source in these has lots of methionine and tryptophan. So when you put the two together, they have a good amino acid profile and they become more of a complete protein. So an example of this would be hummus and pita bread. Okay, so it's a very Middle Eastern dish that, or a bean burrito. So you have the beans, the legumes, and the burrito is from the grain. So together, it's a pretty complete protein. You can see this for other sources down here as well. But the whole concept is kind of mixing and matching the protein sources so you get a more complete one. So synthesis of protein is, again, sticking all these amino acids together. And typically when we think about proteins, we think about long chains of amino acids, so usually more than 10 amino acids, which we call a polypeptide. Now there are some smaller ones like di, tri, and oligopeptides, which are 2, 3, or a few more amino acids stuck together. But for all practical purposes, what we're talking about are the long proteins. And these amino acids are linked by what we call peptide bonds, which is just shown here. It's a carbon-nitrogen bond. So this is the process of protein synthesis, and this is really a critical process. In class, we actually watched a little video. You can go to YouTube and find dozens of videos on this process. And it's really an important fundamental process for all of biology, because this is really what your DNA does. It encodes genes that eventually go on to code for proteins. Okay? DNA does not code fats. It does not code carbohydrates. It encodes the blueprint to make proteins, and then the proteins are the workhorses that go around in the body and make carbohydrates or digest them or make fats or do all sorts of things in the cell. They're the workers, so to speak. Okay? And so the way this works is you have DNA here in the cell, and the DNA becomes, first of all, it's usually tightly coiled. It becomes unwound, okay, which is step one here. Once it becomes unwound, this process occurs called transcription, and this is where you're copying the DNA to messenger RNA or mRNA, okay? And this is essentially like taking a photocopying machine to a set of blueprints, and then you take those out to the construction site, so to speak, okay? So once you have your messenger RNA, it gets chopped up and processed a little bit, so it's only the important sites are left that you need. Okay, this cytosol, or this messenger RNA, then leaves the nucleus and goes to the cytosol. Okay, once it's in the cytosol, it goes to these little brown organelles on the bottom called ribosomes. What ribosomes are the factory that makes proteins, okay? So the messenger RNA has the information. The ribosomes are actually the physical place where the protein is made. And so on your RNA, you can see the green sequence here on the bottom are all these nucleotide codes, all right? And what happens is these codes are read in 3. And depending on the combination of these nucleotides, it tells the ribosome what amino acid it needs. So if we look at our example on the bottom, AUG corresponds to UAC, okay, which are their pairs, which encodes for the protein methionine. So these little cross tan things are what we call transfer RNA. So transfer RNA has 2 purposes. On the bottom, it has this coding region which recognizes a specific sequence in the messenger RNA. So you can see this one, the UAC. And the second point of transfer RNA is it actually carries the amino acid. So it'll grab its specific amino acid, it'll recognize that sequence, and then it allows the ribosome to start sticking these amino acids together in an exact sequence coded by the messenger RNA. So the next one we can see is arginine, and then a serine's coming in here, and eventually what's going to happen is, as you can see way on the right, is you have this string of amino acids, so we're forming a protein here, in a specific order, which is exactly what the messenger RNA has encoded. So that's essentially how we make a protein. Now, what I've just shown you is what we call the primary structure, which is basically just your sequence of amino acids. But once you get your protein completed, it also takes different conformational changes, okay? So we call their secondary structure, where it can coil or form sheets. There's tertiary structure, where it folds back on itself. And then there's quaternary structure, where you can actually get multiple proteins come together as a complex. So when it comes to digestion of proteins, a very important thing is denaturation, okay? So most proteins are kind of coiled up like a string or a rope, all tied up together. But in order for enzymes to get at that and start breaking it up, chopping it up, we need to denature that protein. What denature does is it essentially linearizes it, okay? So it's like if you take that rope and pull the ends, that rope is going to straighten out. And some of the things that do this are acid, which of course would occur in the stomach. So the stomach would denature proteins. Changes in pH, such as a very alkaline condition. Heat. This is what happens when you cook. Okay, when you take an egg and boil it, that heat linearizes these proteins, makes them very rigid. That's what makes an egg white or an egg yolk from liquid to all of a sudden solid. That's the process. Okay, enzymes do this, a variety of other things. Within our body, there's a lot of protein turnover. On any given day, your body's turning over quite a bit of its protein and resynthesizing it, so it breaks down and resynthesizes. And this is probably important for repairing damaged tissue and just keeping your muscle or protein healthy overall. So some numbers behind this. Every day we make about 250 to 300 grams of protein, and about 60 to 100 grams is what we get from the diet. So in other words, most of what we're making is actually just being recycled. So it's from protein being broken down. We get those amino acids, we remake them into protein again. Okay? In the US, most of our protein is supplied by animal products, whether it's meat directly, milk, eggs, etc. The rest of the world is less so, and most of the protein source comes from there, from legumes, nuts, grains, various other things. And this just gives you an example up here. Tofu, I mentioned, which is a product of soy, has quite a bit. They have chicken breast here, but you could put any meat up here. It's going to be very enriched in protein. Okay, legumes and nuts are generally a good source. Dairy products are a good source. And then some grains have a fair amount of protein as well. So this was a question of the day about grass-fed beef versus grain-fed beef, and I'm not going to go into this detail because I'm recording this, but the question was about nutrient composition of the two, and just want to point out here that grass-fed beef not only tastes different, but it also has different composition, specifically higher in omega-3s and higher in specific other nutrients like beta-carotene, vitamin E, and vitamin A. Okay, so how do we evaluate? We talked about protein quality or being complete or incomplete. So how do we evaluate this? And there's 4 ways which I'm going to mention. The first one is rather straightforward. It's called the biological value, and it really means how much of the dietary protein you eat or the nitrogen you consume is converted to body nitrogen or body protein. So it's really your nitrogen retention. So if you calculate this, it's the nitrogen you've retained over what you've absorbed from the diet times 100. So if you take, for example, if you eat an egg, nearly 100% of that protein in the egg ends up in your body, like stored, because almost all that protein and amino acid is the right profile, it's very available, that it's all converted to body nitrogen. Another one, which is very crude, is called the protein efficiency ratio, which really looks just at weight gain based on protein consumed. But the problem with this one is you can gain weight from a lot of other things than protein, so this one is not really commonly used anymore. Another one, which is important because the last one, which I'll talk about, is based on this in part, it's called the chemical score. And so what you do here is you actually measure the amino acids in your protein source, okay? And then figure out what that profile looks like to that of a reference protein. So the reference protein is egg white, as I mentioned, which is about a perfect quality protein. So we'd see the limiting amino acid, or in other words, the amino acids that our protein that we're going to eat has the fewest of, or the ones we need the most, but it has the fewest relative to those needs compared to an egg. So it's just this ratio. And then the last one, which you don't need to know the name, but you need to know the concept, because this is the one that is most widely used. And this is actually the DV, stands for daily values. That is what's used for, you back your food labels and everything else. It's this calculation. And what it factors in the chemical score, So the amino acid profile and the digestibility. So not all protein is 100% digestible. So some of it we eat it doesn't get digested and absorbed and goes out the back door. So this factors in how much we eat is available to us and this amino acid profile, which is really kind of the two important concepts. So just to give you an idea of a few, I mentioned egg white, very high quality. I also mentioned soy protein is the exception for plant proteins. You can see very high protein quality here, beef, and then some other ones like grain, wheat grain, or black beans, you can see have less value, and that means they're more incomplete proteins. And this, I should mention, this is already factored into the daily value. So the daily value just isn't the total protein you're getting, it's also the PDCAS of the protein, so it factors in this quality. So what affects nitrogen balance in our body? In other words, when I'm talking about nitrogen balance, I'm really talking about protein balance, okay? So when would we be in positive nitrogen balance? In other words, when would we be gaining nitrogen, gaining protein? Well, when you're growing, if you think, puberty or infants or times when our body is accruing proteins, accruing muscle. Pregnancy is obviously one. Sometimes if you go through some sort of illness or trauma or anything like this, it can, the recovery period from that, you can be building protein back up. And then, of course, if you're an athlete and you're training to build muscle mass or whatever it may be, you're going to be increasing protein. There's also situations where certain hormones like insulin or growth hormone are really what we call anabolic. That means they promote growth. And so if you have a situation where you have a lot of those around, they will promote nitrogen retention or protein gain. Equilibrium is pretty much, I would guess, most of us. It's when we're probably kind of more in a static equilibrium. We're not gaining, we're not losing. When you would lose protein, the negative nitrogen balance, if you don't have enough protein, if you don't have enough energy, okay? If you don't have enough energy, you actually, the protein you take in, you'll use for energy rather than making your own proteins. Certain conditions, fever, burns, infections, trauma, various things like this. Bed rest, we know your muscle will waste away. If you're laying in bed or you're in space, you're an astronaut, you're going to lose muscle because you're not using it. Deficiency of amino acids, and due to certain diseases and certain hormones also influence this as well. So our recommendations, which again you don't need to know, are roughly a little bit less than a gram per kilogram of body weight. So if you weigh 60 kilograms, you're going to need roughly 48 grams of protein per day. If you're recovering or you're an athlete, you can see the RDA goes up. For most Americans, we eat a lot of protein. Meat is fairly cheap in the U.S., so most people consume a lot of meat, which has obviously a lot of protein. Now, if you look at populations such as infants, such as elderly, such as third world populations, then it's a little bit different story. Then the protein most people may not be getting enough, or not nearly as much as the average adult. So what happens to digestion and absorption? So when a protein comes in your gut, we talked about it being denatured, okay, from either the cooking process or the hydrochloric acid in your stomach. But then there's also hormones such as pepsin, enzymes such as pepsin that come along and break that protein up into either individual amino acids or di or tripeptides, okay, and that's shown in the column or in the cartoon here. Now, once these proteins are digested to these shorter amino acids or peptides, then they can be absorbed, okay, into the enterocyte, which is these, remember that little hair-like cells in the gut, and then they're transported across into the blood. And they go directly into the blood and eventually to the portal vein, and we'll see the liver first. Okay, so just a little overview of what happens here. In the stomach, mostly what happens is denaturation with hydrochloric acid. There is a little pepsin release there, which will start the digestion process a little bit. Most of the proteins will go out into the small intestine. This is where nearly all the digestion happens, and in part, this is due to the pancreas, which releases enzymes into the small intestine for digestion. Okay, then the amino acids are absorbed in the small intestine. They go primarily to the liver, although this can vary depending on the type of amino acid. Okay, so they enter the bloodstream, go to the liver. The liver either uses them as energy, makes proteins, or lets them on through. Okay, and then what's left when you get to the large intestine, it should be very little. Usually, most of the protein is digested and gone at this point. So as I mentioned, amino acids see the liver first, and the liver will use them for energy if it needs it. But if you have enough energy in your diet, then these amino acids be used for protein. Now the exception to this rule, exception to this rule is branched chain amino acids. And these escape the liver, and this is also why you see a lot of the proteins used for weight supplement or supplementing for weightlifters, like the protein bars, protein drinks. They have a lot of branched chain amino acids in them, and part of that reason they do is because those branched chain amino acids, when you eat them, kind of specifically go to the muscle. So not only are they used as a substrate to make protein, but they also signal to the muscle that the muscle should grow. So that's why these branched chain amino acids are in there. Okay, and then also the liver can convert some amino acids to glucose if your body's in a fasted state or it needs glucose. So what do proteins do? A lot. So they are connective tissue, so collagen in our body, actin and myosin are the big proteins in muscle. These are the ones that contract. Okay, so they're very important for body structure. They do a lot for fluid balance. I won't get too much into this, but our blood, for example, has lots of proteins that control water influx in and out of our blood, in and out of cells, all sorts of things like that. They contribute to acid-base balance, so the proteins that transport ions or various things across our cells, those are all proteins. Those transporters are. Proteins in the blood also transport nutrients. So we talked about lipoproteins. Those proteins in the lipoproteins play an important role for carrying things. There's many others. Example, they bind hormones, all sorts of things. And they also are hormones and enzymes and neurotransmitters. So lots of things in the body. So for example, enzymes, when we eat food and we break it down all the way to energy, there's many, many, many steps in there, okay? And if you think about all those steps, each step is catalyzed by a protein. So we have proteins or enzymes that break down the nutrients in that meal. When proteins are transporters that transport those nutrients. And once in their cells, let's say glucose enters a cell, in order for glucose to get to ATP and carbon dioxide, water, an enzyme catalyzes each step of that breakdown. So there's maybe 20 steps to get from glucose to energy. And different protein or a different enzyme, same thing, catalyzes those different reactions. We also talked about proteins being involved in immune function. So for example, antibodies, which you get from colostrum, that first milk for an infant, very, very important. And throughout our life, I mean, much of our immune cells secrete proteins that regulate our immune system. Proteins also are used, as I mentioned, to make glucose. So this would occur when you're fasting, you're not getting glucose from the diet. And of course, we use proteins for energy. We get 4 kilocalories or calories per gram. Now keep in mind, as long as we're eating a normal diet, we're probably not going to be burning much protein. Usually we burn fat and carbohydrates. So the only time you're going to be burning more and more protein is if your diet's kind of out of whack or you've been fasting for some time. Or you eat a very high protein meal, okay, and you have way more protein than you can use. And this just gives you an idea of where proteins are coming from. So we get proteins in the diet, protein from normal turnover and breakdown, and then these can be used for a lot of different things. So we talked about energy, synthesis of things, a lot of different things we talked about. They can also synthesize non-protein compounds. The carbon skeleton, so if you get rid of the nitrogen, what's left is what we call a carbon skeleton. You can use that to be used for energy, to make ketones. You can use it to make glucose. And then if you're getting rid of this nitrogen, if you had the deamination that's occurred, that's again, you can go to the liver to make urea, then the liver sends the urea to the kidney to be excreted in the urine. So what are some health concerns of protein? The malnutrition regarding protein and energy or energy intake. So these two diseases are called marasmus and kwashiorkor, and they're both really kind of forms of inadequate protein and or energy intake. And we won't spend a lot of time on this, but you can see the developmental or the characteristics of these two different diseases and what cause. I mean, there's obviously lots of complications to these, but why most people die from this, or the number one cause of death from this, is the susceptibility to infections. So if you don't have enough protein and or energy, then your immune system becomes compromised and you can't fight off a normal infection that most people would. And as a result, you can die from it. The other concern on the opposite end of the spectrum is high protein diets. So these are ones that probably, there's a lot out there, but the ones that's gotten the most attention over the last 30, 40 years is the Atkins diet. And what these are, they're high protein, but they're usually also low carb. Okay, so those, you're taking out carbs and adding proteins essentially. And fat can be changed too, but that's not a main point. Why people use these, we talked about people have used low carb or high protein diets to control seizures. And when they did those initial studies, Dr. Atkins and others noted that these people, in addition to having less seizures, they also lost weight. And so they became interested in this. And the reason some people lose weight on these types of diets is because protein basically turns off your food intake centers in your brain. So it makes you feel full. So you eat less food is the reason you lose weight on these types of diets. Nothing magical about them. They just make you eat less. Okay. Now the problem is there's not many long-term studies on these, so we don't know what the long-term health consequences are. But most evidence suggests that it's probably not great. So even though you may lose some weight, this is not a sustainable long-term diet because it can perhaps affect the kidneys. If you're limiting your intake of, for example, fruits and vegetables, you're going to be limiting vitamins and minerals, etc. And also you might be eating a lot if you're eating bad things. So if you're eating a ton of meat, you're probably going to be eating a lot of cholesterol, perhaps saturated fats, many other things that maybe you don't want so much of in your diet. So we also, one of the problems with eating certain proteins is allergies, okay? And what allergies are is basically your immune system recognizing that protein in the food as something foreign, and you get an allergic reaction, which means your immune system gets all revved up and it starts causing inflammation in your gut and maybe other places in response to this food or this protein from food. Okay, there's several food groups, roughly 8 food groups account for nearly all of the food allergies. These are nuts or peanuts, tree nuts, eggs, fish, shellfish, soy, wheat, and milk. Okay? What can happen when you eat these, usually the second or third time you eat them, you can go into what we call anaphylactic shock, okay, or anaphylaxis. Anaphylaxis, I can't talk today, which is basically your immune system gets so revved up it's out of control and actually do so much damage to you, it'll kill you. Usually what happens is the immune system revs up and it constricts your lungs, and so you can't breathe. So this is obviously a very traumatic thing. This is why people carry, they call them EpiPens, epinephrine pens, which is if you go into this type of shock, you can give yourself a shot of these things and they will make your body relax and calm down, and you will, you won't die from it. So we can avoid these, or at least help avoid these by doing certain things. I should mention most allergies, not all, but many allergies happen when you're young, and many people outgrow them, okay? So when you're a kid, it's not uncommon for kids to have allergies, but most of the time they outgrow them. But having said that, obviously they're adults with allergies too. So what we can do is avoid eating these highly allergenic foods during breastfeeding, because many of those proteins in the foods are transferred into breast milk, so the baby can recognize that. Feed babies breast milk for a minimum of 6 months, so don't expose them to food right away. Avoid cow's milk for a year, egg whites for 2 years, and then some other allergens for up to 3 years, including fish, nuts. And again, most kids outgrow these. So that is where I ended off for this particular lecture for Tuesday, October 13th. And I guess that is it. I will pick up the rest of protein, and we start the alcohol chapter on Thursday.